What are the risks involved in purchasing a property interstate? Now, when you're looking for a property interstate, there is a lot of risk involved, and those risks, if you do not minimize them and you cannot correct them, you are going to have a lot of problems moving forward. It can put you down financially. You can really put yourself in a world of pain because property is an expensive transaction. You're using other people's money, and this is something that you want to make sure that you minimize that risk because it's not a game to play around with. It's not like stocks or maybe Bitcoin. You put a grand or two in, it goes up and down. Maybe you might lose that money. That's hypothetically, yeah, you might lose that money. Okay, now if you lost 1,000 or 2,000, no biggie. But when it comes to property, you're using other people's money. So if you're putting a 10% deposit down hypothetically on a $500,000 property, let's say hypothetically you're putting $50,000 in, you're borrowing $450,000 from a bank. $450,000 from a bank. So if you make the wrong decision, it can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's something to take into consideration. So look, what are the risks involved in purchasing a property interstate? You can't see the property. You can't drive past the property. You can't see it. You can't see the street. You don't know anything about the property itself. Okay, you can't see it and go. You can't walk and do an inspection and look up in the corners and see if there's some plaster cracking, or you can't look into the shelves. You can't go outside and see the exterior walls, or if it needs a paint, or if it's on a slope. You can't see these things. You can't see the neighbors. You can't speak to the neighbors. So this is something that it's a downfall. It's a risk. It's a risk involved. Okay, so take something to take into consideration. Not knowing the area, you can't drive around and see what the streets are like. You can't go down the road and see what the neighbors are like. So you don't know anything about it. You don't know the good pockets or the bad pockets of the streets. You don't know where the busy roads or the quiet roads are. These are things that you don't know. So you can't see the property. You don't know nothing about the area. You don't know the demographics of people. You don't know what's the good pockets. You don't know what schools are good. You don't know where the rough areas are where you don't want your kids, or maybe you don't want to just have a property there because why? Because it's going to affect your tenancy rate. So these are things to take into consideration. Finding trusted professionals on your team. You don't know any property managers to look after property. You can't trust them. You don't know if they're going to do the right thing by you. Same goes for a real estate agent. If you're looking for a property, you can't trust them. They might be telling you fibs. They might be lying to you. Who knows? I'm not saying they all do this, but you don't know. You can't trust them. You don't know them. You can't go there and have a chat with them. You can't see their body language. Same goes with pest and building experts. You don't know them. You don't know if they're going to do the right thing by you. You don't know if they're liaising with the real estate agent and the real estate agent saying, hey, just say nothing's wrong with the property so we can sell the property. You don't know these things. Same goes with tradesmen. You don't know if they're ripping you off, if they're going to the work and they're just adding things on top of the bill because you're not there. Same goes with a conveyancer. You need a conveyancer to do your conveyancing. So you can't use a Victorian conveyancer, for instance, to do a New South Wales or a Queensland or a South Australia contract. You actually have to use someone that's got a Queensland license. If you're purchasing a property in Queensland, they need to have a Queensland license when it comes to conveyancing or a solicitor. So that's something to take into consideration. Next thing is not knowing the market well. So you don't know what the cycle's in. You don't know if it's been growing for a certain period of time. You don't know where it's in its growth phase. You don't know much about the vacancy rates. Maybe you don't know much about the rental market, or you don't know much about certain things about when it comes to analyzing a property. Maybe infrastructure projects, creation of jobs, employment hubs. What's going on, movement of people. These are things that a lot of people do not take in consideration. So you have to understand these things. Why? It's going to help you make an informed decision. So when you can't see the property, you don't know the area, you don't know nothing about the location, you don't have trusted professionals on your team, or it's hard to find those trusted professionals, and you don't know the market timing, this is something that, there's a lot of risk involved. Because if you don't know these four things, if you don't have these things down pat, you will make a lot of mistakes when investing interstate. Now, what are some of the advantages? Okay, well, let's talk about market cycles. Different market cycles. So every state, every suburb, every LGA have different market timings or different market cycles. So, for instance, now we've got I don't want to talk from a Melbourne or Sydney or Hobart perspective. I want to talk about internally. So let's say, for hypothetically, you're in Brunswick, Melbourne CBD, 9 kilometers north of Melbourne. Okay, that market there in Brunswick might be growing at different growth points from a capital perspective, and it might be growing at different price points when it comes to your rental market. So your rental market might be increasing or decreasing compared to maybe Noosa in Queensland, or maybe in Elizabeth, South Australia. So all these markets will time at different times when it comes to capital growth and their rental markets. So this is something when you invest interstate, you got different rental markets. So you might be in your own backyard, for instance, you might live in Sydney or Melbourne, and that market, you don't know where it's in its growth phase. But let's say you've done your research, you've known it's already had a few years of massive growth. Now that growth is not sustainable, because normally there's a 5-year window of massive growth, and then after that it kind of starts to not decrease but not have the same significant of growth in the first 5 years. But when you broaden your horizon and you go maybe into a regional town or interstate, what happens is those property markets might have a different growth phase, and what happens is they're in a different market cycle, and they might be at the beginning of their growth phase. So you've got 5 years, you've got in there in the right time. And so you can absolutely time the market. Now, you can't time it precisely, but you can make a calculated decision. So that's what the benefits are. Land tax. If you invest all your property in one state, you're going to have a hefty land tax bill. Now, for instance, Melbourne's got very strong or very high land tax fees. Now, if you look in Queensland, they're not as high, but Queensland have regulations where, for instance, if you don't have greater than $600,000 of land value in your portfolio, then you don't have to pay any land tax. Where in Victoria, doesn't matter if you have 1 or 2 properties, doesn't matter the land size, doesn't matter the value of the property, you're going to have to pay land tax right away. Okay, so there's different land tax concessions in every different state and territory. So it's something to take into consideration, which brings me to your next one, which is your low stamp duty fees. Every state and territory have different stamp duty concessions. Queensland and New South Wales are probably one of the cheapest in the country. But if you look at Victoria, it's the most expensive when it comes to stamp duty concessions. South Australia is pretty expensive as well. So if you're someone that doesn't have a larger deposit, you want to get into a market, and of course, and you got a certain amount of deposit saved up, you've worked your butt off and you want to get into the market, okay, and this is your stepping stone. Maybe, if you purchase, let's say hypothetically, you purchased a $300,000 property in Victoria and you purchased a $300,000 property in Queensland, you can save quite a significant amount of dollars, thousands of dollars, on stamp duty fees. So that's something to take into consideration. Next thing is diversifying that portfolio. So let's talk about market cycles again. And land tax. This comes all in the one thing when diversifying that portfolio. If you have all your properties in one state, you're going to pay higher land tax. So if you diversify your portfolios, but you're going to pay less in land tax. Not just that, different market cycles when it comes to capital growth points of view, and as well when it comes to your rental markets as well. So those rental markets will be starting their growth phase as well on the rental side of things at different times. So that's something to take in consideration. If you have all your properties in one suburb or one local council area, you're going to have, when the market drops there, and you've got all your properties in that market, your whole portfolio is going to drop. Where if you've got your portfolios all scattered around the state and territories in Australia, you're going to have different market cycles. So you're diversifying. It's like stocks. It's like you don't buy maybe all mining stocks, or maybe you don't go buy all retail stocks. What you start to do is you start to diversify your portfolios with stocks. Same goes with property. Now, even though it's houses, but every market, every individual state, territory, region have different economic drivers. So what I mean by this is you might have certain regions that might be not dominant, but they might have different growth economic drivers. For instance, they might have retail, construction, maybe healthcare, maybe administration that are driving that market. Where if you've got another property in a different region, they might have mining, agricultural, maybe health, maybe education, maybe some retail. So there's some different diversifications of different economic drivers. And what happens is if something happened to the market, a recession happens, something like a COVID, what did we see? We seen retail got shot. We've seen those, you've seen the shopping centers getting all closed down. You started to see the gyms getting all closed down, and things like these started to happen. But what was still going? Agricultural was still going. Mining was still going. certain facilities, certain things were still operating, like your professional industries. Okay, so this is something to take into consideration. Not having all your properties in the same region with same economic drivers. Okay, and so that's going to minimize your risk dramatically as well. So when there's ever a drop, not all your properties are going to drop. Great opportunities. Next one. You look in your own backyard, you only got access to one market. If you broaden your horizon all over Australia, you've got greater opportunities. Now, there's over 15,000 suburbs in Australia. Now, of course, not all those suburbs are A-grade investment area locations. But if you can target these areas by doing the right due diligence, doing your research, understanding infrastructure project, movement of people, economic drivers, vacancy rates, your days on markets, and all the other nitty-gritty things when it comes to property investing. If you can understand that, there's great opportunity. There's always great opportunity. Maybe different asset classes as well, blocks of units that are more affordable in certain regions that are going to help with massive cash flow. Not to say you can get more, they're more affordable. Maybe it's properties that are bigger blocks, a freestanding home, in a great location, but it's more affordable than where you live. Maybe you live in the capital cities, so you can broaden your horizon. Okay, so this is something to take in consideration. If you look in one state and territory, or where you live, you only got access to one, basically, region, which is maybe your local council area, and that's all you know. Now, different laws and regulations. So there's different stamp duty laws and regulations. There's different concessions. Okay, when it comes to I've lost my train of thought here. When it comes to your zoning, so when it comes to zoning and your property zoning and what the regulations are when you want to build or develop or subdivide or add a granny flat, there's different zones and regulations. For instance, in Victoria, if you have a house and on the back of the house you want to build maybe a townhouse or a granny flat and rent it out as a separate dwelling, what's going to happen is you have to actually subdivide the block. Now in Queensland, depending on the block, depending on how you do the project, if you want to add a granny flat at the back, you can add the granny flat at the back. You build the granny flat on the back of a house. What happens is you add that as an extra dwelling. So what happens is now you're getting two rents from a property, from one block of property, one property where you've added another granny flat at the back. Now you don't have to subdivide the block. So that gives you the opportunity to save a fair bit of cash from subdividing, because subdividing is not a cheap thing. Now, there's different laws and regulations as well when it comes to contracts, when it comes to cooling off periods, and it comes to regulations when it comes to, I guess, your whole documentation of your contracts. So that is something to take into consideration. And of course, there's all other different laws and regulations that go along with property in different states and territories. So it's something to take into consideration. So the pros and cons, okay, we've got here. If you don't do the right due diligence, the risk involved is ginormous. So people have to make sure if they can minimize the risk interstate by making sure they got an independent person that knows the area, that can see the property, that's got their best interests in heart, and that are going to do the right due diligence and tell you if the property's good or not, or if it needs a lot of maintenance. They know about the areas, the bad areas, the good areas, the good streets, the bad streets. They're more the high-end markets, so you can make sure you get into those markets. Maybe you got a team of professionals. So you got a property manager, a real estate agent, you got a trusted pest and building specialist. You got a tradesman that you can trust, because someone that you trust in the region. Maybe it's a property manager that can put you onto someone, as well for conveyancer. Most importantly, a buyer's agent, because a buyer's agent will have all these resources that can help you minimize that risk. And then I guess knowing the market well. So you're knowing the market cycle, you're knowing what's going on, you've done the right due diligence, your research from, making sure there's infrastructure projects, jobs creations, movement of people, economic drivers. These are things that you've got to take into consideration. So the risks are greater. So if you don't minimize the risks and you just go in there blindly investing in the state, you will, have a lot of pain if you haven't done the right due diligence. So there's more greater upside, but if you minimize your risk, there is a significant greater upside when it comes to investing interstate, significantly, and it can help you build your property portfolio 10x faster, literally 10x faster. So this all comes down to the individual, comes down to your strategy, but most importantly, your understanding, your research, having a team of people, your knowledge comes down to this as well. So if you don't minimize that risk, I can't rave on enough. You will suffer, and this is something to take into consideration. And I don't mean this in a bad way. I mean this because property is a expensive transaction. You're using someone else's money. You're going to a bank and getting a loan. If something goes wrong to that property, and it's going to cost you not just $10,000. It's not going to cost you maybe $50,000. This is going to cost you hundreds of $1,000s, because it doesn't cost $10,000 or $50,000 for a property. You're paying hundreds of $1,000s for a property. So you got to make sure you're actually taking a calculated risk decision. You're minimizing the risk, but it's calculated, and you've done all the right DD. Once you've done that, you're going to reap the rewards. Investing in different markets, investing interstate or regional. So take this into consideration, learn from this, understand these point of views, and this is going to help you become a better investor as well. The greatest investors don't all put their eggs in one basket. They diversify their portfolio. When it comes to property, you diversify just your portfolio, your property portfolio. I'm not talking about diversifying everything when it comes to finance. You stick at one thing and you diversify the whole portfolio when it comes to property. Same with stocks. If you're heavy on stocks, you diversify the whole portfolio of your stocks, and you focus just on stocks. You don't do property and stocks, because you can't be great at two things. You can only be great at one. Just take that in mind. So make sure you watch this video again if you didn't quite understand what I was talking about. Make sure you take this into consideration. It will help you minimize your risk involved.